Hi guys, it's Jeff at Slavens Racing. This video is my top 10 mistakes and problems I see the guys have with their suspensions. I ride a lot, and this year I'm really riding a lot because I only work on Mondays now, just for a few hours. So I'm out on the trail as much as I can, and I ride with a lot of different guys, and I go to riding areas where there's even other guys there that I talk to and sometimes help. And over the years, I've let a lot of people ride my bikes. And the most common comment that I get when they get off my bike is that it's a cheater bike. That it's so easy to ride that it's like cheating. And yeah, I throw more money at my bikes than most people do. Obviously I've been in the industry for over 50 years and I'm getting old and I'm trying to preserve this old carcass of mine so I can keep riding longer. So I want comfort and stability and reliability, and I want a bike that works as well as I can make it work to help me out so I can ride longer. I'm 69 now and I still ride with a lot of young guys, and I, for the most part, run their pace. And I ride a lot of gnarly stuff. So when guys tell me that my bike's a cheater bike, I usually ride their bike at the same time, and my thoughts are usually, how in the hell do you even ride this bike, let alone ride the speeds that we've been riding? Their bikes are quite often absolutely horrible. The suspension's horrible, the engine doesn't run right. The brakes, just the list goes on and on and on. So today I'm going to focus on, those top 10 mistakes or problems that guys have with their bikes, and just in the suspension department. And right now I'm going to start at the front of the bike. And I don't work on people's bikes anymore. I haven't done that for a number of years, but I do, I don't have a shop that does that anymore, but I do work on my friends' bikes once in a while, and occasionally I'll have a customer that has a problem that they just can't seem to resolve. So I'll bring their bike over to my man cave and work on it for them for free. But almost always, I'd say at least 80% of the time, the first thing I notice about their bike, just wheeling it into my workspace, is that the steering head bearings are loose. I'm very picky about that. Loose steering head bearings drive me nuts. I can't ride a bike all day long with loose steering head bearings. I got to pull over on the side of the trail and fix it. So what does that mean? Well, there's a bearing here and a bearing at the bottom of the steering stem, and they're tapered and they have to be pulled together because they're a tapered bearing. They're tapered like this, and as you tighten down this nut here, it pulls those bearings together and gets rid of that free play. And how do I always detect that? Is with the front brake. So when I'm pushing the bike, I grab that front brake, and there should not be a clunking sound for sure, or even a little ticking sound, or even any kind of a feeling of this shaft through here, the steering stem, moving back and forth. It should not be moving. It's only supposed to rotate. It's not supposed to move like this. And it makes the bike feel vibrating. If you're crazy and you like to go 90 miles an hour down dirt roads, what will give you a high-speed wobble for sure. It can cause instability issues in other areas, so slower speed areas as well, not really tight stuff, but medium speed stuff. And then it also makes the bearings wear out quicker because they're loose, and so they're jiggling around in the race. All right, so the way you correct that is you loosen the pinch bolts on both sides, just on the top, leave the bottom ones tight. Loosen these and loosen this. This is a KTM 300. This applies to all KTM models, all the late model Husqvarnas and gas. and many other brands. I mean, it applies to most brands, but some of them, the adjusting procedure is different. Some of them have an adjuster underneath here that you have to tap or use a spanner wrench on. But with KTMs, you just loosen these pinch bolts, loosen this pinch bolt, and then you tighten this. And I can feel, I mean, I've got a really sensitive feel about this. I can feel when this nut is like, you know, a 1/16 of a turn loose. I'd say probably for most people it's going to be more of a turn, but if you've got a definite clunk or a vibration or whatever, it's probably at least a half a turn loose. So there is no torque setting on this because, well, there just isn't. Because if you torqued it, yeah, let's not even go down that road, but there is no torque setting on this. You just have to do it by feel. So if you loosen all these pinch bolts and then you're able to turn this, you know, with very, very little resistance, well, you've got loose turning head bearings. And so you're just gonna have to kind of develop a feel a little bit or experiment a little bit with it. You don't want them too tight to where the front end is getting bindy and feels like the you've got a steering damper that's too tight. You know, it's still, if it's up on a stand, the fork should still move freely back and forth. So, loosen everything, snug this, tighten everything back up, ride it, or push it. All you gotta do is walk with the bike. You can just, you know, tap that front brake as you're walking with it, you can feel it. And I swear, at least 80, probably 90% of the time when I ride somebody else's bike, those bearings are loose. Or if a guy brings a bike to me, those bearings are loose. All the time. And I'll mention to the guy, oh, well, I didn't notice that, or I just adjusted those, or, you know, they kind of get defensive about it sometimes. But, all right, so fix that. Of course, you want to make sure that these bearings are in good condition. If you bought the bike used, and you don't know the history of the bike, and it's not real, you know, unless it's a really low mileage bike, so if it's, you know, got quite a few miles on it, well then you need to go through the whole bike and service everything. So you need to service these bearings. Chances are they don't need replaced, although we have those in stock for all the models, but they definitely need to be lubricated. And then also the linkage bearings, you know, on the back, and the swing arm bearings, same thing there. What you don't want to do, guys, is, you know, one of the things on my list, my top 10 list here, is guys trying to tune worn out suspension. You know, a bike that has a lot of hours on the suspension with really gunky oil, and the bushings are getting worn out in the forks and the shock. And, you know, the components just need to be rebuilt. And I see this all the time. Guys buy a bike that has quite a few miles on it, and they're trying to tune things, and the components are worn out. You know, maybe the shock steel's even leaking a little bit, but maybe the fork steel is even leaking a little bit, and they're trying to tune out worn out components. That doesn't work. Don't waste your time. All right, so that would be one of the top ones there. The next thing is the triple clamp bolts. Make sure that they are torqued according to the factory spec. A lot of KTM forks, this one doesn't, a lot of KTM triple clamps have the numbers stamped on them on what the torque setting should be. That's usually in Newton meters. You can do it in foot-pounds as well. But make sure these are torqued correctly. The top one, if it's over-tightened, it's not that big of a deal. But if these lower ones are over-tightened, they will actually distort the outer fork tube. And then when the lower fork tube and its bushing slides through this area, it binds. So don't do that, because it will create a huge wear issue. It will, all that stuff that's being worn will flake off and get into the oil and jam up the valving. We'll wear out the inside of this tube and make sure these are torqued correctly. All right, and then the axle pinch bolts. I have a separate video on that, which you should watch, but I quite often see, for one thing, the pinch bolts are way over torqued.
I mean, you go to loosen them and they'll make a pop sound because they're so bound up. But the bigger issue is on KTMs, you pull the axle over to the left side. And when I say KTMs, I'm talking about all the KTM brands. KTM, Husqvarna, and Gas, and Husaberg. Everything has to be pulled over to the left side. But then guys quite often in that process, they pull the right side fork tube over. So it ends up, instead of being parallel, it's pulled over and it's binding. I have a separate video on that that you should watch. Okay, so from there, we go to the back for a minute. And that is, this is a PDS bike, so it does not have linkage. But the hind joints on these wear out, which is this joint down here on the bottom where the shock bolts under the swing arm. And they'll wear out and get a bunch of free play in them. And then same thing on linkage bikes, the linkage gets worn and gets a bunch of free play in it. Or at that point, maybe that's even corroded and it's binding up. So you can't even get a good sag measurement with it. And if you have a little bit of free play up here, we'll say you have 3 millimeters of free play at the shock, well, that's going to translate to, 8 to 10 millimeters of free play in the back. And so that is uncontrolled movement of the rear wheel because the shock cannot control that free play. So that's definitely a problem that should be addressed. So before you go through any of these procedures, make sure that you have components that are in good condition, that have recently been rebuilt by a professional or by yourself if you're a competent mechanic. But just make sure that everything's fresh before you go through any of these steps. I lost my list, guys. Hold on a second. All right, guys, so if you've got fresh components, you've done the stuff on the front I just mentioned, you've got good bearings, all that kind of stuff, or maybe you've got a brand new bike, where do you go from there? All right, so I would start with spring rates. All the time we get customers that call the shop and say, I weigh 240 pounds plus my gear on top of that, and I've cranked and cranked and cranked on that shock spring and I just can't get the sag number right. Well, no kidding. Really? If you look at the manual, it shows that the spring rates that come on these bikes on KTMs is 165 to 187 pounds. So a 22 pound range. On a Beta, it's about a 15 pound range. And then the Japanese bikes have similar ranges as well. So if you're not that 165 to 185 pound guy with your gear on, including your gear, then do not waste your time trying to set the sag because it will not set. You cannot get it adjusted correctly. Don't waste your time. And if you crank and crank and crank on the spring, you're just overloading that spring and it's going to coil bind and possibly break. So please just leave it alone at that point. And wait until you can afford or have the time to put the correct spring rates in there. All right, so how do you get the correct spring rates? If you have one of our main brands, KTM, Husqvarna, Gas, or Beta, we've got spring charts on our site. The spring charts are very accurate, and our springs are very accurate, but the problem area is guys don't plug in the correct information about their weight. It seems like skinny guys don't want the world to know how skinny they are, and heavy-duty guys don't want to know how heavy-duty they are. And they lie to themselves, and I'm not trying to offend anybody here, but that's what I've seen for the last 50 years, and come up with a different number than what's reality. So weigh yourself on a scale, weigh all your gear, all of it, or put it all on and get on the scale. But you can do it as in 2 separate measurements and add them together if you'd like. to come up with an accurate number of what you actually weigh with your gear on before you go riding. And then plug that number into our chart. All right, so the next thing about the chart is, to say the chart, the dividing line, well, say you weigh 245 and it says at 247 you need to go up to the next spring rate. Well, which spring should you use? Use the one that's on the chart. Use the one that the chart says you should use for your weight. Don't try to split the hairs, all that kind of stuff. Well, I'm almost into the next spring rate. Well, don't do that. All right, so put accurate numbers into that chart and live by it. If you just put those springs on your bike with the 5 millimeters of preload on the forks and whatever the factory manual says, the owner's manual says for the preload on the shock spring, if you just set it up with those preload numbers, you're going to be within 95% of accurate. You could do that without even taking a sag measurement and go have a hell of a good time. The bike's going to work well. So I'll be making a video soon on sag and balance. It's going to go into a lot of detail. So stay tuned for that. That'll be coming up here in the next few weeks. And I'll go into a lot of detail on how to get the correct sag and all that stuff. So let's see, from there, sorry guys, I'm kind of tired and I'm getting a little forgetful here. I'm going to have to look at my list. Okay, so clicker settings. That's a common one that we get questions about and a common one that guys make mistakes on. All right, so where do you start with clicker settings? Go to the KTM, go to your bike manual, and set them at the stock settings. I think they give you, I should have looked, anyhow, just the stock settings, how they're supposed to come from the factory. Set them there, that's a neutral setting, and then you can tune it from there. So if you feel like it's still too harsh, then back them out. And if your components, your suspension components are all stock, going 1 or 2 clicks is a waste of time. I would go 3 to 4 clicks at a time. Probably, for me, I would go 4. The factory, the OEM clickers are not all that sensitive. The ones on my National Forks and Shock are, but the stock ones are not. And if you think you're going to come up with some perfect setting with stock components, you're probably not. You can quite often turn those things until the cows come home and still not be happy, but if you want a starting point, start with the stock clicker settings. I can't give, you guys always want to know some secret setting. Well, there is no such thing because we all ride differently. We ride different types of terrain. Our bikes are in different condition. We sit differently on the bike. There is no perfect secret setting that I can pass on to you. If there was, I'd give it to you. For my suspension components, and for me, I'll gladly pass those on, but those are very expensive blackjack forks on there, and I've got a National Shock on the back. So unless you have those components, I can't really help you. I'll be glad to pass on those clicker settings, but beyond that, I can't really help you. Other things that really have a big effect on the suspension are the tire sizes. Try to stay as close as you can to the stock profile. In other words, the profile is the height of the tire and the width. I see guys that put on these huge back tires. They're really tall, and they're really wide, and they're really heavy. And what does that do? All that weight, the shock has to control that extra weight. So the shock is going to run a lot hotter. It's going to have a lot harder time controlling that weight. It might not even have enough valving to control that weight. And you know, it detunes the engine basically because it takes a lot more horsepower to rotate that bigger, heavier tire. So, and then the profile of it really will throw off the balance of the tire, of the chassis. So if the tire is a lot taller, you know, than the stock tire on the back or the front, it's going to throw the bike out of balance. So be careful with tire sizes. And I'm going to cover that in that upcoming video on suspension balance and sag settings. Another problem I see with guys is they're afraid to touch it. It's like they're going to blow it up or they're going to break it if they turn a clicker. Well, don't be that guy. If your suspension's bottoming or riding low or diving on downhills or in corners, do something about it. Even if it's wrong. You know, turn the clickers and try to make it better. And if you turn them and you make it worse, well, then you know you went the wrong direction. So just go the other direction. But don't be afraid to touch those clickers or that sag setting, because you could be just a few clicks away from a great ride, a great performance. I think that's about all I have today. That's probably 10 or more items I planned on covering. Let me just review my list here real quick. No, I think that's about it for now, guys. If you have any questions about this, post them at the bottom of this video, and I'll be glad to answer them. Like I said, I'm not in the office a lot, but I try to answer the comments on YouTube daily, if not every few days. But so definitely post comments if you have some other questions. You're also welcome to email me at info@slavensracing.com. You can also call the shop and ask for Alec. He's up to speed on most of this. And most important thing is after you get it working right, get out and ride. Wear out some tires, do some throttle therapy. Please like us on Facebook and Instagram, and subscribe to us on YouTube. All those things really help us. I'm trying to help you. I'd appreciate it if you'd help me just a little bit. And get out and have a good time. That's all for now.